I think self-indulgence is definitely an issue. And I think self-indulgence is when we engage in care with no thought or no intention of trying to help. If I don't sleep, then I can't help, right? I shut down, right? If I don't take care of my trauma, then the trauma gets in the way and I start reacting to it, creating more harm for people around me. I think when we really approach self-care in times of crisis, the emphasis is I'm doing this thing for myself because I want to be resourced enough to show up to help others. Because if I am not resourced enough and try to show up to help others, then likely I become work for other people. I become part of the crisis. This is the whole thing about love and particularly rage. I have to take care of my anger or else I start reacting to it, creating more harm.
Welcome back to the Sounds of Sand podcast. My name is Michael Riley, and today I'm in conversation with Lama Rod Owens. Lama Rod is a Black Buddhist Southern Queen, an international influencer with a Master of Divinity degree in Buddhist Studies from Harvard Divinity School, with a focus on the intersection of social change, identity, and spiritual practice. He's the author of the new book, which we discuss, The New Saints, From Broken Hearts to Spiritual Warriors, Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger, and co-author of Radical Dharma, Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. His teachings center on freedom, self-expression, and radical self-care. It's a delight to be in conversation with Lama Rod, and I think you'll really enjoy this episode. All today on the Sounds of Sand podcast presented by Science and Nonduality.
Welcome to Science and Nonduality. What is non-duality?
The universal forces.
It's the collective consciousness.
Being aware.
Trauma is not the external event that happens. Trauma is the impact of that event, which is the disconnection from ourselves.
That matter is energy, energy is matter. That's what EMC squared is about.
There's a language without nouns. There is a language without subjugation. There's a language without objectifying.
But if it's recorded, then there is a collapse. But if it's not, then it's the infinite potentiality.
Okay, I'm here with Lama Rod Owens for the Sounds of Sand podcast. Thanks for being here, Lama Rod.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
So your last conversation with Science and Nonduality was with Victoria Santos during the Dying and Living Summit. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but it was during the early days of COVID, the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, yep.
Which was, it was 3 years ago, and I guess a lot has changed, but also not so much has changed, in the sort of underlying fabric of what's going on. And you have this wonderful new book, The New Saints, which just came out, and we'll get into that. But I did want to start with the violence and the war that's unfolding now in Palestine and Israel. And you shared this quote on Instagram, I think last week, and we reshared it at Sand. And the quote reads, face the chaos, let your heart break, ask to be cared for, be uncomfortable, accept everything as it arises, then do the work to change what needs to be changed. So my first question is, when we're all collectively feeling so helpless to do anything, there. What is the work to change, and what do we do? Like, where do we start with this?
Yeah. I mean, it's a mountain of trauma, of grief, of rage, of hopelessness, right? On top of that, there's this collective disembodiment as well, which has been going on, for a long time, right? And so when all that kind of comes up all at once, then we can feel really disempowered and really helpless, right? And so much of my work, regardless of what's happening, no matter what is really happening in the world and on the ground, there has to be space for us to turn attention back to our own experience, right? I can't really be in the world helping and disrupting and abolishing systems of violence if I haven't done part of that work for myself first. How can I actually really promote an ethic of love, right? And compassion if I actually have no idea what that means for myself, right? And I think it feels really counterintuitive to say, yeah, there are people dying, right? Not just in the Gaza Strip, but like all over the world, in the Congo, for instance, at this moment that no one's talking about, right? There's always this level of violence happening, right? And at some point, I have to understand that if I really, really want to see the change that I need to see, I have to start embodying, these principles, these ethics, right? Because that's going to guide me to actually doing transformative work, right? Where it needs to be done, right? Whatever change that I want to see in the world, I have to experience it first for myself. And I think this is what all our great change makers have done, right? They just didn't show up, they had been training, they had been planning, they had been going through their own practice so they could actually initiate the change that, for someone to change the world, change our countries and cultures, right? This is why we love them, right? So this is really important for all of us. It's like I have to take care of myself in order to take care of the world.
Yeah, well, a lot of that resonates with me, but I think, I don't know, it just feels like self-indulgent or something to even think about self-care when there is all of these polycrises basically unfolding.
Yeah. I think self-indulgence is definitely an issue. And I think self-indulgence is when we engage in care with no thought or no intention of trying to help.
Right.
If I don't sleep, then I can't help.
Yeah.
Right? I shut down. Right? If I don't take care of my trauma, then the trauma gets in the way and I start reacting to it, creating more harm for people around me. I think when we really approach self-care in times of crisis, the emphasis is I'm doing this thing for myself because I want to be resourced enough to show up to help others. Because if I am not resourced enough and try to show up to help others, then likely I become work for other people. I become part of the crisis. Right. And this is what I was, looking at in Love and Rage, which was my last book that came out during the pandemic. Right. I have a tendency to drop books during world crisis, but like unconsciously, I guess. But, this is the whole thing about love and particularly rage. I have to take care of my anger or else I start reacting to it, creating more harm for everyone. Right. So I know it's really it feels counterintuitive. It feels really uncomfortable, right? I work with a lot of activists who, say the same thing. This feels self-indulgent, right? But I also say that like you're working harder than you realize as well. And there are, these experiences that don't register with us consciously that start showing up in other ways, and when we start implementing plans of like care, then we start taking care, we start restoring ourselves in ways, that are really important, that we may not be able to name or talk about, but is still really supporting us to show up and be present.
When we think of compassion, and you speak of fierce compassion in your book, compassion often has a connotation maybe of softness and allowing and empathy. But what you're talking about is developing the inner strength, the inner resilience to really bring that fierce compassion when it's needed.
You know what? There's nothing more important than giving a shit. Right? And I'm talking about giving a shit about everyone and everything, including the people or the communities that have hurt you. So when I talk about compassion, I'm talking about acknowledging that there's suffering, discomfort, violence, harm happening for myself and for others. And that ultimately we all want to be free from that suffering. And so when I start embodying that ethic, then I actually am called into action, right? So I feel the suffering that's happening, and I need to disrupt that suffering. And so what am I going to do? Right? I'm compelled to disrupt suffering because I know that others in my life have done this work for me, teachers, friends, family, whatever, right? There are people who've intervened to help me to suffer less. And now I feel obligated to offer this same support to others.
And I guess also getting back to the idea of the helplessness that when there's these wars raging, like you said, in Congo or Ukraine or wherever, there's very limited things that we can do, but we can help. There's still people around that we can help. We can go outside, and there's probably someone on our block who needs help today, who needs our compassion.
Yeah. I mean, there are people who are just struggling to navigate this period. And if I feel resourced enough, then I offer that support to people. And it's like calling up friends, calling up family, just checking in on people, like being emotional support for folks right now. And then on top of that, it's like, and then figuring out what I can do, right, to disrupt violence happening maybe in a place or a country that's very far away from me, or trying to get involved with an issue that seems like has nothing to do with me, but I still feel compelled to be a part of helping and being a benefit, right? And these things can be really small things, but like I think what's most important is education. Let's get clear about what's happening, right? Yeah. And as there's not a lot of real education happening around the crisis that's happening and the crisis that will emerge. Everything's interconnected and rooted, so nothing is just appearing and happening out of nowhere. Right? There are histories to everything, and we have to learn those histories to start making really informed decisions around how to be beneficial, right? How to stop the war and the suffering.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's a huge part of giving a shit, as you said earlier, is knowing, just bearing witness, just knowing what's going on. Not just blindly following the sort of corporate media narratives and be like, well, I guess that's it. Like, we have the resources to do the digging, to really, compare and contrast what different narratives are saying is happening.
Yeah. I mean, and this also really goes back to caretaking. How do we create a kind of an etiquette of care that helps us to hold space for our emotions? Because we can get really emotionally reactive to everything. And yes, emotions are full of data. As I have always said, anger is full of data. Sadness is full of data. They're telling us really important things about our experience. But an emotion isn't factual. It's not historical, right? It's a response to something. It's a embodied somatic response to the phenomenal world that we learn how to pay attention to, right? So yeah, I can feel really outraged. I can watch, a report or a news segment and say, oh my God, and then I say, okay, this is how I'm feeling. This is where I'm at in my body, right? I go through my practices of going into feeling more grounded, more stable. And then I say, okay, what's really happening beyond this? How can I start seeking out other information? How can I start listening to other people, right? And we live in a time of social media. So this is we have a different access to information than we've had, in the past, right? So I can hear the voices and listen to people who are in the midst of these conflicts and crisis, right? And that can change my view, right? And inform how I feel,
Yeah. Yeah, I saw also, I think it was today or yesterday, you were posting about Ma Tara.
Yeah, Ma Tara,
and when you're talking about hearing, bearing witness it brings to mind Avalokiteshvara, and
Yeah.
it's recontextualizing that for the modern age that,
Yeah.
people in Gaza have smartphones and they're able to make videos on the ground and upload them to Twitter or YouTube or whatever. And we can see that and we can hear their voices like almost instantly.
Yeah. And then that brings into question the real conflict, which is, am I ready to change how I understand something? Am I ready to evolve? Right? Because it's easy to get comfortable in these old ways of thinking and being. Right? And comfort is something we start hanging on to desperately. Right? And that creates another kind of suffering for us, a kind of tension.
Yeah.
Right? And to be in the world right now, we have to be willing to change.
Yep.
Like, we have to be willing to evolve, right? We have to be willing to say, you know what, I didn't get that right. I really didn't understand this previously, and now I'm getting new information, and I'm ready to like kind of lean into this and see where this takes me.
Yeah.
Right. But that's heartbreaking work. Right. We've built our identities around bad information. Right. And these kind of mythologies, around nation states and countries. Right. I mean, I just think about America. I'm just like so over it now. Right. Like, and you have to start telling the truth about where we live and how we've been living and what we've consented to believing in, and start letting go of that, and then doing the letting our hearts break. But in the midst of brokenheartedness, we do the really transformative work of mourning. Right? Like touching into that sadness, that disappointment, and just like forgiving ourselves, telling ourselves it's okay, remembering that we're not the only ones moving through this. And we have to do this, yes, individually, but also collectively as well. This collective mourning can really help us to transition into the reality of things and saying, no, this is what's happening. Like this is happening in this moment. And that's a part of the work around compassion. Right. Particularly the tradition of Matara is just like, no, like I have to tell the truth, even though this is so fucking painful.
Yeah.
But I'm not the only one trying to do this. And the people that I love the most, these people who I adore, who I, study in terms of like being these great change makers, had to go through this. Right. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the heartbreak that change makers had to endure in order to create the change for all of us to benefit from. Right.
Yeah. It's one of the comforting things I think about, the Buddha's concept of dukkha, of unpleasantness of life, is that it's so universal.
Yeah.
And so it's like when you're in the midst of it, you can be like, well, at least I'm not alone,
Yeah.
Heartbreak or kidney stones or whatever the dukkha is, it's universal.
Anything that we could possibly experience, there are other beings going through it at the very same time.
Yeah.
Right. And this is what it is. Like, as the Buddha taught, like, yeah, there's suffering in life. Like it's not a punishment. It's just how it is, because this isn't who we are. Like this reality isn't our home. Of course it's not going to feel perfect.
Right.
And
the Buddha, he didn't bury the lead. It's like, it's the first noble truth. He's like,
exactly.
This is it. And it, like I said, it created this universality to it where it was accessible to anyone, no matter how, your economic status or class or anything like that. It's like, it's just so universal.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the thing that really drew me into Buddhism, was that was the first teaching. There's suffering. And I felt like that was such a radical and kind thing to do. Not to lead with the comfort, the pleasure, but to say, no, like you're suffering and you're supposed to be suffering. Right? This isn't extraordinary. This is where you have to start. And I said, thank God that I'm not being gaslit anymore. That like there's something wrong with me because I just don't feel well enough. Right.
Yeah.
No, it's just like, yeah, this is a part of what it means to be in this body, in this realm. And this is where you can start to get free from. I was like, great, sign me up.
So I wanted to get into some of the concepts in your book. Well, there's concepts, but there's also really beautiful practices in your book. So I highly recommend this book because it's almost like a manual for, the current age, and
exactly.
And you've included so many different references, let's say, where people I think can feel held and like, okay, this can be my entryway to get into this practice, which I really loved.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It is a manual, right? Because, this book started happening or kind of coming about right after I published Love and Rage during the quarantine in 2020. And this is, of course, with the murder of George Floyd, kind of re-sparking the movement for Black lives. And for books, I have these actually two tendencies that I've noticed with books. First, I'm inspired by something that's happening in the world to start writing a book. And then when the book drops, it's addressing another thing that's happening in the world that I did not foresee. Right? But like I wanted to offer something for, really for young people. For younger millennials, for Gen Z, right? Maybe for a few Gen Xers, but like I'm like in this really particular position where I'm either the youngest Gen Xer or the oldest millennial. Okay. I'm in that really that space where we don't know who we are, right. Because we feel like we're both generations, but I was like, young people need something. And I think as I get older, I want to take eldership really, really seriously. And so I want to give back something, So I was like, yeah, this world is real challenging, right? And this is what I've done to navigate this. And this is the tradition that I've used to do this navigating. So I want to retranslate this tradition for you. So you don't have to go through the process of like having to show up in like a Buddhist center or, and go through this process of metabolizing these ancient teachings into something that feels more contemporary. I've done it for you. So here it is, right? And if you want to go deeper into the tradition, then by all means, you have this as a manual that opens the door to that. I didn't have this. Yeah. I had to start, sitting in the back of the meditation hall, struggling through these concepts and these ideas in a place that really wasn't concerned with justice or identity, just really concerned with comfort and stability. Yeah. And just like the Buddha, I started with the suffering. Listen, like this is a real fucked up situation here. So let's get working. Let's get to it,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the second time you've mentioned this word comfort. And what it's bringing up for me is like how much of our, polycrisis, whatever you call it, all of these things happening are stemming from our obsession with comfort, our destruction of the planet, our need for resources. It's all driven by this aversion, this fear of discomfort.
Yeah. The fear of discomfort and not having the capacity to really metabolize suffering without overconsumption. We use consumption to bypass suffering. right? Which has, yeah, of course, a direct impact on the planet. Like, we just can't keep using up resources,
Yeah.
But what Buddhism taught me to do was like, listen, like, you can't get free bypassing what hurts.
Mm-hmm.
The only way to get free is by turning into the hurt and learning how to transform the hurt, right? And get free from your attachment or fixation to the hurt, to the suffering, right? And to heal, to do the hard work of healing, right? Which is letting go, releasing, bringing back together, right? But also letting go of who you think you are at the same time. And yeah, that's really uncomfortable, but there's also, in the discomfort is also a kind of comfort, strangely enough, right? It's a kind of like, you start getting really used to the ways in which work opens up these really spacious, fluid experiences that make joy much more accessible, right? So as I'm doing really hard work, I'm also getting more and more connected to joy. So joy and hard work can happen at the same time, which makes hard work sustainable. Like in the midst of really hard emotional processing and labor that I do for myself, in that moment of just being trapped in it or feeling trapped in it, I can say, oh my God, I'm so grateful that I'm doing this in this life, that I have these practices and these tools so I don't feel victimized by the suffering, but I can partner with the suffering to move through it, to transform it, right? And this creates less work for others around me in their caretaking of me. Like, what a wonderful, amazing opportunity, and that gets me through.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of, the sort of the 12-step tradition where it's you work through your addiction and the goal, the end step is to help others now. It's like now and that's what I think keeps people on that path hopefully free from their addictions, is that community that happens of helping others.
Exactly. And community is the key thing here.
Yeah.
Right. We rely on others.
Yep. Yeah, that's one of the really nasty narratives in capitalism is like, you got to fix yourself on your own. Like the hurt we're feeling is collective, and it's happening in collective. Capitalism is it's this collective unconscious thing that's just coursing through our veins and coursing through our ecosystem, and yet we're supposed to individually get by, without community, and it's very toxic. You just mentioned this in your previous answer. So this idea of helping others, this is, I think you say this explicitly in your book, but this idea of the new saint is in some ways synonymous with the bodhisattva path, right? The idea of bringing that to other people.
Exactly. Right. I mean, the bodhisattva, in terms of, Buddhist tradition is the spiritual saint. It's the spiritual warrior, right? And it's a position that we take, or a vow that we make that says that, like, no, the most important thing that I can do is get free from suffering and help others get free from suffering, right? Because this isn't where we belong. This is just this experience that we're stuck in at our detriment, right? So the bodhisattva awakens a little bit and says, you know what, I'm going to do something different. I'm actually going to try to get free and see if I can get others out of this as well. So this is a collective motivation. It's not just me, but it's all of us, right? Like, we all deserve to be free. And what am I going to do to support this project of collective freedom?
And something that I always was curious about is because like when I hear this, the idea of the bodhisattva path of liberating all beings, it sounds very evangelical to me. And we all know the problems with evangelical Christianity, this idea of like converting people. Does that resonate, or does that make sense at all?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I come out of that.
Okay. Yeah.
I was raised, in a community like that. But, the thing is, freedom is something that we have to consent to, right? And if someone doesn't consent to it, then there's nothing else that can be done, right? And what we talk about, what we see in like this kind of Christian right-wing nationalism is this idea of freedom being imposed on all of us, which is just a reiteration of capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, right? That's not freedom. That's getting more indoctrinated into the system to benefit a handful of folks. So when we talk about the Bodhisattva vow, and particularly how I reinterpreted the Bodhisattva vow and tradition in the New Saints, is that like, no, let's understand freedom as a complete transcendence of suffering, a complete, kind of revolution in who we think we are and what we think we are, right? But that can't happen until you consent to the process, right? So if I am forcing you to get free, even though like I may think that my work around liberation is the real liberation work, like if you don't consent to it, then if I force you into something, then it just turns into violence.
Right.
And so much of this kind of work that I'm, offering folks is that like, if people don't want to get free, you have to mourn that, not continue to impose like liberation work on people. You say it's not your time. In the same case with me, like I wasn't born Buddhist, right? But I from a very young age, I was really interested in justice and freedom work. But I knew, about looking back, I can understand rather that like I had to really actually choose this for myself.
Yeah.
Right. Like, because there were, many times that people came to me before I, kind of got into Buddhism, where people were like, oh, you need to do this, this, and that, which looking back would have been great ideas, but I just wasn't ready. Like I was ready when I was ready. And this is when the Bodhisattva really activates. It's like when someone's ready, then you offer support. Right. But also like the Bodhisattva, I was surrounded by Bodhisattvas, and not even knowing it. There are people who were embodying compassion, love, liberation my whole life. I didn't necessarily get that was what they were doing, but it influenced me nonetheless. So I can look back and say, oh, such and such really embodied authentic love, and it really influenced me. And now I can claim that and name that, something as an inspiration, which I do in the book.
Yep.
I ask people to go back and think about times where they felt real love from someone.
Yeah.
Right. That's what the Bodhisattva does. The Bodhisattva just loves. And when you're ready to get hooked to that love, then you start the work of liberation from self-hate.
Right. Yeah, that's, I guess, too, the idea of embodiment. Like the Bodhisattva doesn't need to tell you that about love. They just are love. And it's to transmit it to you and when you're in their presence.
That's it. And that's why I am not interested in people being Buddhist. Like I'm not interested in standing on the street corner proselytizing. I'm not interested in forcing what I believe onto people. Like that's just not, that's not my agenda. I want people to be free, happy, and resourced and safe.
Yeah.
Period. However you get there is your concern, your business, right? If you ask me for help, then I help, right? But I'm just concerned with people having what they need. Right. And however you get that, because like I'm very fortunate to have friends and colleagues and family really from different traditions, all kinds of traditions and spiritual paths. Right. And they're understanding freedom in their own way. Right. And they're understanding freedom in a way that's not about creating harm for other people. Right. It's not about forcing other people into their beliefs. It's really about saying, this is what I'm doing to get free. Right. And I'm not so interested in, again, like converting people to Buddhism, I don't want to see a Buddhist world. Like, I know that's strange to see. I don't want to see a Christian world. Like, I want to see a world where people are choosing paths of liberation that reduce collective harm and violence, that helps us to live together harmoniously without the need to colonize or dominate each other because we feel insecure about what we've chosen to practice as our path, right? Dominance comes out of like deep insecurity, like, like that somehow this isn't going deep enough, or somehow that this isn't authentic enough, or it comes from this experience of how ego co-opts spiritual liberation work, right? So the ego just turns all this work back into itself and says, you know what, everyone has to be like me in order for this to make sense. I mean, it's dangerous, as we know. We're very familiar with the danger. And I think for younger generations, I think it's natural for a lot of them to have this kind of suspicion of religion, particularly religion, the structured, dogmatic expression of religion that seems really rigid.
Yeah.
It's
totally
important to point out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's science and nonduality. Like, we present spirituality, but much more on the mystical path, which is the experiential. It's the it's transcendence through experience, not through dogma. Yeah.
I mean, that's important, experience, and that's Buddhism, like experiential, and that's what the Buddha taught. Go and like test this out. If it doesn't work, then don't do it.
Yeah. Was it ahi? No, I forget the Pali word now. Ehipasako, I think. Come see for yourself.
Yeah,
that's what it is.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, come see for yourself. It's like, don't take my word for it. Try it.
Exactly. And so many people are afraid because maybe they'll discover that like what they've devoted themselves to isn't what it is. And that's heartbreaking. I know, I've been there.
Yeah.
Right, but you have to be willing to go through that.
Yeah, and for me, in my practice in Buddhism as well, it's like it's comforting though when you try these things. Like, I remember when I was first started getting into meditation, I was terrified at what I would find when I let my mind stop.
Yeah.
I was like, what if it's like anger and hatred and jealousy, and that's my core being? I was really, resistant to letting go of my ego, letting go of my mind. And then when I did that and finally like had glimpses of the chatter stopping, and all that was there was joy, I was like, wow, it's just what it says is there.
Yeah.
Equanimity and joy and all these exalted states are actually there. It's not just a story.
Yeah, exactly. I was very similar, but like every time I sat and meditated, like the suffering was there, it felt super amplified. So it took me years to really stabilize in meditation, but you stay at it. And this is the advice that we have to like reiterate over and over again. It's a practice. It's called practice for a reason.
Yeah.
It's like we have to keep doing it over and over and over and over again. And for many of us, it takes years to get to these states, right, of touching joy, equanimity, or meditative stability, right, of being really able to hold awareness consciously, right?
Yeah.
Like, it takes time, but like this is what we have to do to commit to liberation. Liberation is a very long timeline, and we have to start it somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of the activist, social justice things that you write and talk and teach about, they become framed through the wisdom practices, like you were talking earlier about allowing the space for the emotion to take place, and that can only happen through gradual meditation practice, right?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not something we can just turn on and it works. Right? but it's something we commit to, right? Like it's important to, again, to reiterate that like the real change you want to see in the world has to actually begin in your own body and mind. Right. We have to at least get to a place where we're able to hold space for everything so we can transition from reactivity to responsiveness. Right. So I can choose how to respond, not just react. Right. Just I can see what's happening. I can hold space for a lot, and I can make a choice to say, this is what I'm going to do.
Kind of a basic question about the title of the book, The New Saints. And, I think in the first chapter or second chapter, you're talking about these sort of iconic saints that we know, like Martin Luther King Jr. or, Thich Nhat Hanh, Greta Thunberg, whoever, these very charismatic people who are able to carry a message. And do you think that that's part of the, like if there was a Martin Luther King Jr. in Palestine or in the Congo or wherever there's injustice happening, would that paradigm of new saints, basically, do you think that would make a difference?
Well, I think that like a new saint is really someone who shows up with this altruistic attitude to free beings, to benefit beings. And the real change makers, right, who created the most change for us in our different cultures were people who look just like us, who talk just like us. So the Bodhisattva and the new saint, they take on the expression of the culture. They take on all these identity markers, right? They have to be of the people. Right. And so and there are a lot of there's so many change makers, right? But there are certain causes and conditions that come together for people like Dr. King or Malcolm X or whomever to really have this kind of prominence and attention. But I think that core characteristic is a deep love for people and a deep commitment to freedom that inspires. Like we can feel that. I can feel, in my case, I can feel someone's authentic commitment to getting people free. Like there's a love or an energy or a frequency that I just feel I resonate with, and that galvanizes me, that pulls me close to them. Right. But I think there are a lot of people like that. They're just not like social media stars. Right. They're not, they're not people that we're like writing stories about and broadcasting all over the place, but they're doing work. There are a lot of invisible new saints keeping people alive that will never be celebrated or written about in history. And that's not the motivation either, is to be known, right? To be celebrated. No, it's not my motivation. Like, I just want to help. And it just so happens that I get attention, but not to get lost in the intention, but to always come back to the work of saying, I'm here to get people free, not to be a personality, right? Not to be, a best-selling author or whatever it is to help people suffer less, period.
Yeah. And that intention resonates for you, I guess writing a book is hard. It's hard work, Yeah. And there's probably days where you're like, you know what, forget it. My other book was good enough.
Yeah.
But that intention of help because I think also too often it's maybe an author feels like there's some sort of gap in the knowledge that you need to fill. It's like you have to write this book.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. And it's like also for me, it was also saying, I have something I have something very particular to say as well, which is the same as filling a gap. But like I was like, no, there's something that I can say uniquely that I know will help at least a few people.
Yeah.
And that's enough for me.
Yep.
To do a book.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said earlier, I think it appeals to so many different types of people. It like feels so inclusive in terms of just the language and the references you make.
Yeah.
I love all the references to Pose. I love that show.
Oh yeah. Yeah. But again, like it's just like I wanted also to write a book for people coming from the same communities that I do, because I didn't have a teacher that looked like me.
Yep.
When I was coming up, I didn't have Black teachers or Black lamas. I, still don't really have Black lamas, but like I didn't see myself reflected. But I did have teachers who were really committed to reducing harm and suffering and getting free, and that was enough.
Yeah.
They didn't have to look like me. They didn't have to come from the same class. They didn't have to be queer, or whatever. But I just wanted them to be compassionate, and that's what I got.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm I think I'm not alone. There's, countless people who are glad that you're out there teaching what you teach, writing what you write about. Because I know for me, when I'm in my dark places and I'm like looking on YouTube for a teacher or a Dharma talk, there's something about like Michael Singer, for example. Yeah. Like he sounds like me, talks like me, has the same kind of sense of humor. And when I'm feeling dark, it's like I want someone that feels like me, And I think you're giving that to people, and there was a big gap in that,
Yeah. It's like people get it. Like if someone looks like you feel like, okay, they get it. So when people come to me, who I mirror, and they're like, well, this is impossible, that's impossible, we can't do that. And I'm like, well, I come from the same place you do. I come from the same communities and same identity locations. It's hard, but I did it. And that kind of like just looking like the people that need help is such a huge benefit.
Yep.
I can just walk into a room and just sit on the teacher's seat, and that's enough for some people just to see me do that. And that encourages them and inspires them to continue going to see me. Right. But I hope this book opens up the door for a lot of folks, who don't see themselves reflected, to feel inspired to say, you know what, if Rod did it, I can do it.
Yeah. Yeah, because, people will say like, oh, the Dharma is universal. Like there's no identity in the Dharma. But like, I remember I grew up in Philadelphia. Like I remember walking past, like Black Baptist churches.
Yeah.
And I would hear the music happening, and I would see them happening outside, but I didn't feel like, okay, well, this is a place where I'm going to go as like a white kid. It's just like so sometimes you just don't feel, and I'm sure many people of color feel about that, especially about the so-called mindfulness, like American Buddhist circles. That it's very exclusive, and it just doesn't feel like I don't think that's for me. Just because of the way that people look. So
exactly.
I think
it can be a complete turnoff.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And it's just, it can be very subtle and energetic too.
Well, just one thing that comes up about this too is that like this kind of like Western white convert Buddhist community, aren't necessarily about freedom and justice.
No.
And that's the issue.
Yep.
That we have to talk more about, and I tell, and as I say in the book, it's like, I'm actually teaching from a place of liberation and justice. I'm not teaching to get people to be more comfortable or happier. And I think that's the project of, I would say, mainstream mindfulness, contemplative arts in general. Contemplative practice is like, oh, let's just get people kind of regulated, and assimilated comfortable, so they can produce more and be more, whatever, efficient.
Yeah.
Right. But not to teach people to pay attention to their bodies and minds so they can start divesting from systems and institutions that create harm and start reinvesting in the truer expression of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the project of Buddhism.
Yeah.
But it still gets kind of confiscated by this
Yeah.
kind of relative comfort and happiness.
Yep.
Which is limiting. I tell people, listen, like, yeah, I'm talking about liberation, but you're going to get to happiness and comfort and all this stuff. And, you're going to get there automatically if you just shoot for the end goal, which is complete liberation. Everything is going to happen. But if you're just wanting to be comfortable, that's so limiting. You're going to plateau.
Yeah.
But you're going to still plateau within experiences of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You can get comfortable and happy and bypass and push away suffering real easily. And that's how we get into overconsumption and capitalism, and these other systems, So we're trying to transcend all of that,
Yeah. Yeah. It's, talking or staying with this idea of the American Buddhist practices. It's like, it's very extractive too. And I've talked to monks about this. Like a lot of kind of white Buddhist centers like to kind of take out parts like, secular Buddhism, that whole school. It's like, we're just going to take out the parts that we like, that make us feel good. And the rest of it's, karma and rebirth. That's kind of silly, superstitious stuff by less primitive people. But also, as you're saying, social justice. I mean, the Buddha, he was revolutionary in many ways. The way he invited women into his sangha and it dispelled notions of caste, the caste system.
Yeah, yeah. The Buddha was a cult leader. I mean, so many of these great religious, spiritual leaders have arisen in cultures that have been really rigid. And the Buddha arose and started doing this work. Right, to erase caste division, for instance, right? And he was looked at as being subversive, a threat, in the same way Jesus was, But we lose that spirit, because when something gets really big and institutionalized, right, it loses it really loses its original focus, because the original focus was so intense that it had to be watered down in order to get more people into it. Right. You talk about, you say, well, we're trying to get free from suffering and we have to go through all of this and we have to move into this really intense balancing, of form and the formless, or emptiness and form. Like that's real intense work, and it takes a lot of labor, to do that. But again, for me, that's why Buddhism was so important for me, because it was like, there's suffering and here's the work to get free. And I was like, I'm sold, and I'm not afraid of working. I come from people who work, right? I descend from people, who had to survive enslavement and genocide, right? So I have that in my DNA, right? So I'm attuned to this project of liberation. So again, I don't believe everyone again should be Buddhist. Right. Again, like that's not my project, because not everyone is ready for this particular kind of liberation work, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I say also that I'm not trying to be everyone's teacher. You lose integrity when you're always trying to like recruit and be accessible for everyone.
Yep.
Right. And when I say accessible, it's not, I'm not saying that like I shouldn't be really conscious of trauma and and identity, because I am. But when I say being too concerned with accessibility, what I'm really talking about is that like you stop telling the truth about what the work is because you don't want to scare people off.
Yeah.
right? So I have to talk about the heartbreak because that's where you're heading. If you sit down on that cushion, this is what you're heading into. And I don't want to lie to you, because if I lie to you and say it's going to be all like roses and puppies and rainbows, and then you're just like crawling through the most intense trauma, then you're going to think I'm lying to you, and you're going to lose faith
Right.
in this. So just again, just like the Buddha did, just tell the truth up front. Yeah, this is real fucked up. And guess what? Here's the path to move through this.
Yeah.
And it's not easy.
Yeah.
But we have a sangha and
Exactly,
teachers that they can help.
Yeah. Yeah, you're not alone, which is
Yeah.
the silver lining in that dark cloud of suffering.
Yeah.
Hey. One last thing I wanted to touch into, which I was really blown away with this chapter, is on prayer. Because I was not expecting a chapter on prayer in this book.
Yeah.
And it was
probably
really
not a chapter on loving God either.
Yeah. Yeah. But you said earlier, you wrote this before. You wrote this kind of as we were coming out of COVID pandemic, before Ukraine war, like these global wars were started up.
Yep.
But when I came to that chapter, I was just like, man, this is what we need right now, is just prayer. And this is what got our ancestors through maybe harder times than what we're going through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, prayer is important for me, and as I talk about in that chapter, when I came into my tradition of Buddhism, which is Tibetan Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, or often I just say Tantric Buddhism, like it was nothing but prayer. And I was like, oh, this is so boring. Why? Like everything, you couldn't even eat without doing like a 10-minute prayer, right? I was just like, I'm over it. But as I grew into my practice, as I reconnected to my ancestry and how I grew up, I really came back to prayer in a way that just felt really like vital and nourishing and really sweet. It just feels like an extension of meditation practice for me, just an opening, a connecting, a feeling held, of articulating the change that I need to see and asking for help.
Yeah.
Right. And it just really, once I started really taking prayer seriously, it really transformed everything for me.
Yeah.
But we have to figure out what we need. And that's what prayer has helped me to do. And we don't know what we need. This is why we overconsume. This is why we're confused. This is why often we find ourselves in the conflicts that we're in, because we haven't been taught to name what we need, not what we want. Like we all know what we want, right? But when I say need, I'm like the things that I need to get free, the things that help me to get ready for deeper compassion, love, and kindness and care and everything.
Yeah.
What I need to really belong and to be a part of communities. What do I need to survive? Right? Like those needs, and prayer has helped me to figure that out.
And maybe we close with a prayer of would you mind closing us with a prayer? Would that feel okay? Or
Absolutely. Well, I can read a prayer from the book.
Yes, that would be great.
And this is on page 227 of the book. And this is a prayer for light. I am praying for light today. When I say that I am praying for the light, what I mean is that I am deciding to become the light. I also accept that there is darkness in the world. I understand that the darkness I see in the world is also the darkness I see in myself. There is no darkness in the world that does not also abide in some form in me. When I acknowledge the dark, I am also acknowledging that I cannot know the blessing of light without first naming the darkness. Therefore, while I pray for light and love, and love the light, I will also love the darkness, because whatever I choose to authentically love, I allow it to be free. I choose to let my darkness be free so it can stand next to the light. When they are standing together, they will tell the true story of my life. And in that truth-telling, I will accept both the light and the dark, and know that the dark is only a place where the light has not learned to live. As I decide to become light, I am also praying that I develop the courage to learn to live in the dark places.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you for listening to The Sounds of Sand. We invite you to explore more of our talks, dialogues, videos, articles, events, and offerings through our website, scienceandnonduality.com. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider becoming a member to access our massive library of Sand content, available exclusively to Sand members. And we would love it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google, and Spotify. And share this episode with your family, friends, and all sentient beings. Be well.